First of all, the drive in was dreadful. If it's snowing here, it's always really snowing there. And the worst part was actually the last part, because you folks in Eastern Michigan don't know how to drive in the snow. Zipping along at preposterous speeds, we saw no less than 4 or 5 spinouts with police cars making sure you noticed them turning. We did not. And isn't it ironic that your musician, who is so close, had an accident, and we who live so far did not? But we are grateful for all good gifts. I'm glad to be back. It's beginning to be something of a habit with us. Although if we don't have to have it in the snow next time, I could be okay with that. Where do sermons come from? It's almost a question like, where do babies come from? There are answers, but they're difficult to express. But they come sometimes out of nowhere, or in this case, they came out of a box, quite literally. 2 boxes are sitting on the floor of my home office. Now that I'm retired, I'm looking at these old sermons and saying, well, maybe there's still something left in them from years ago. I was very naive then, but every now and then I would say something worth, and by golly, I did. The task I'm giving myself is to transcribe them from paper. Remember paper? Remember typewriters, which would put ink on the paper because you pushed a key and it would. Anyway, I'm putting and I even typed on the back of old stationery. That's how little money we had at the beginning. Anyway, as I reread them, it seemed a couple of good ideas were still there. So when Dan called me, I said, by golly, this one has legs. And then I read it again and realized it had too many legs. It was way too long and rather academic, the way young preachers are, where they want to demonstrate that they're smart and stuff. So I've trimmed it a bit and made it more current. But the ideas are exactly the same ones. Back then, being a new graduate of seminary, I wanted to show how smart I was and quoted Ralph Waldo Emerson, our favorite almost Unitarian. He wrote at one point, man, it was the 1800s, man seems a young child and his huge globe a toy when the mind opens and reveals the laws which traverse the universe and make things what they are. What am I and what is? Asks the human spirit with a curiosity new, kindled, but never to be quenched. The guy could write. I'll give him that. When I used that the first time, I was 27. I felt young. I felt just like that person Emerson was talking about. I'm 73 now. But my preschool-aged grandchild gives me ample opportunities to be reminded of how the world can still look like that. He still thinks of the globe as a toy, something to be not so much played with, but to be engaged without any assumptions. He invites me to feel again that curiosity, new, kindled, but never to be quenched. If you're a grandparent, you know exactly what I mean. We adults, especially those who have not reached the age of immaturity, meaning grandparenthood, agree with the Apostle Paul when he said, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Let's be grown-ups, why not? But then a child comes along and with their innocence remind us that the world, the globe, the universe is still new because it's new to them. And when did it cease to be new for us? I think great minds are able to get back to that childlike quality better than many of us. There's a story told about Albert Einstein that the doorbell rang and he opened it up and found a little girl standing at his doorstep there in Princeton, New Jersey. She had a notebook in her hand and said she was having trouble with her arithmetic and that he'd heard that Mr. Einstein was pretty good at it. Couldn't he help her? He agreed. And they went up to his study and did her homework. Now, here's the deal. I'm willing to guess that Albert Einstein learned as much as she did about how to see the world afresh, to see numbers as mysteries, not just tools. He was entranced, re-entranced. He regained his innocence through someone who reminded him it was always there. Perhaps Emerson and Einstein and other great people with names that start with E knew as much as they did because they were able to be innocent, even though they were old and wise. Maybe there's something to that saying from Jesus, you must be as little children to enter the kingdom. That is to say that we do not become so wise and mature that we forget who we really are. But this is a hard quality to define. What is innocent? Well, I looked it up. We always look it up. That's what we Unitarian Universalists do. We go to our Bible, known as the dictionary, and to its New Testament, the thesaurus. Innocent conveys something harmless, rather powerless, blameless, lacking in guile or guilt. When we think about that, of course, another biblical story is kind of typical Adam and Eve. They were harmless, blameless, lacking in guile or guilt until they were tossed out because they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so we conclude they were expelled because they now knew good from evil. That's not the way it is. That's not what got them tossed. It was that they didn't follow directions. They were told not to, and they did it anyway. If you've ever had a child or a grandchild, you know you don't punish them for what they did, but for not doing what they were told, for defiance. My point, though, is that ignorance of the truth is not itself innocence. We should not equate ignorance with innocence, so we should stay away from that. There are plenty of ignorant adults who are anything but innocent. Do I have to look toward Washington? Is that over there? So if ignorance is not itself innocence, as we all know, then maybe knowledge is not what kills our innocence. I want us to remember that. Maybe knowing stuff doesn't render us not innocent. The oracle at Delphi, legend says, was asked who was the wisest man in the world, and the priestess answered it was Socrates, because he knew how much he didn't know. In a paradoxical sense, the more we learn, the less we know. I'm reading all the time. I know less and less every day. So in a certain bizarre sense, for grown-ups, knowledge is an essential part of innocence, because the moment you think you know everything, you're no longer innocent. But the moment you read or find out something that conflicts with what you already know, then you have to think about it all over again, and behold, you are now innocent again. At this point in my 46-year-old sermon, I went down a couple of rabbit holes to demonstrate my erudition. I will not do that to you. I'll save us both from that and get to my point, which is that innocence is sorely needed among the adults of the world in our nation, which is enthralled by the powers and principalities of wealth and expertise, beyond those who cannot see beyond their own importance. We need new innocence about what could be as well as what is. And even in our religious movement, which continues and always has struggled to define itself as to what it is and isn't, we must continue to be innocent about who we are and who we are not. Back in 1862, on the verge of submitting the Emancipation Proclamation to the Congress, Abraham Lincoln softened them up with a message he sent. In part, he wrote, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. Boy, does he sound like he could be talking to us right now. As our case is new, we must think and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. His point was to get them to think that the war was not simply to preserve the Union, but to end slavery, to change their perspective and therefore be disenthralled. To disenthrall oneself is to incorporate innocence, to look at the world through a different pair of eyes than the ones you already have. As Einstein learned arithmetic from the school child, often children are our best teachers. Do you remember the hymn we sang? I seek the spirit of a child, the child who meets life naturally. I don't know about you, but every day I wake up, I feel like, whoa, I got a new day. This gets even more profound with age, let me let you know. And there is the mystery of sleep altogether. I mean, I know when to eat because I'm hungry. I know when to drink when I'm thirsty. I know when to sit up and sit down, but I cannot will myself to sleep, and yet it must happen. I seek the spirit of a child, the child who meets life naturally, the child who sings the world alive. My 4.5-year-old grandson makes up songs. I think that's exciting. Do you ever go around hearing adults doing that anymore? I have 2 teachers of innocence, and obviously one of them is a toddler who is in his last year of preschool and is very wise about that. And we have an infant granddaughter who is 3 months old. The 4-year-old absolutely lights up when he discovered that 2 and 2 make 4. My God, it was as though he had uncovered the theory of relativity. And he had. Just think about how astonishing it is that there are such things as numbers and we can make them work. It really is a marvel. My infant granddaughter has just realized that her hands can grab things. She looks as she puts her hand on the burp cloth or on her own hand, as though this is something happening outside. She's discovering her capacity to make choices. And meanwhile, we're just putting our hands casually left, right. It is astonishing when you think about that we can do this. And if you've ever been disabled, you know how miraculous it is that any of us can do this stuff. I seek the wonder of a child who sees delightfully. Now clowns and cloud, now golden sun, imagination's true and free. Okay, so we're driving here today, and it's snowing. And as I say in Michigan, a day without snow is a day without sunshine. You got to remember Anita Bryant to get that joke. And then as we're reaching Lansing, there's this dull, bright spot in the sky. I said, look, sweetie, there's the sun. I might as well have been 6 years old. It wasn't absolutely out, but you could make it out through the clouds. And it was oddly cheering, even though it kept on snowing. Now, Michigan's the only place I've been where you can see the sun and have it snowing at the same time. But that's also kind of the experience of being here. Way back in the years before I first wrote this sermon, I was a student minister. And I was at a church board meeting at my student church. And I don't know about your boards, but they have a capacity to get rather tedious. Oh, is that the laughter of recognition? Nothing was getting done, and everyone was working like the devil not to do it. One of the members of the board, though, had brought her 2-year-old to the meeting. As things got worse and worse, I found myself mugging with the child and teasing across the table, making an absolute ass of myself. After a while, he and I were so bored, I made the excuse of going for coffee to escape. He came with me, and before we knew it, we're running up and down the hall, playing tag, making way too much noise. And when we all came back, he was tired, and so was I. All my frustration had been spent in goofing off with this 2-year-old. My headache was gone, and so was my anger. And they were still in the meeting and were no closer to a solution than when we left. Tell me, who got more done in that 10 minutes? We adults can be so responsible that we can imprison ourselves in adulthood. We can prevent success by being earnest about trying to find it. Do you ever doodle at a meeting? There's that little kid in you making its way out, very subtly. You wouldn't want everyone to see. But those silly little pictures, those shapes are all the way your kid is saying, come on, it's time to play. You know it's better. Whether we realize it or not, we still have a child that wants to show us the way, because children that we encounter as adults remind us that our innocence is still there. If that were not true, then no grandmother would ever play peekaboo. If that were not true, no father would take a son or a daughter to a baseball game. If that were not true, mothers would never bake cookies and Santa Claus would leave his milk untouched. Our first blush of life is never lost, just set aside in the dusty bin of sentiment for sharing only at odd and unwelcome moments. Speaking of baseball games, I have another story to tell. This time I was the child and still in that student church. That same church had a picnic every year. Do you remember when churches used to go out? And they had a softball game at the same time. Everyone would play. And there were always two teams, and the captains had been the same for 15 years. And one of them called themselves the Saints, and one of them called themselves the Sinners. And every year the Sinners won. Naturally, I wanted to cheer on the Saints, so I joined the team. Now, I was a bigger guy then, literally a little taller, several more pounds. And so late in the game, the score was even, and I came to bat with two men on base. A solid pitch came my way, and yes, I connected, and yes, it went into the center field, and yes, it was a home run. 15 years of defeat ended that day with my lucky stroke. It was Father's Day, it turns out, and the wife of the newly triumphant captain took me aside and said to me, Pat, she told me, that was the best Father's Day gift he could have had. Did I try to give it to him? No. As a pastor, I would have said, Happy Father's Day, but as a kid playing baseball, I gave him a great gift without even trying. I want us now to turn to the world we live in today. We live in a time of political trench warfare where neither side is willing to give an inch. Each side is dug in, each of them lobbing virtual bombs and bullets, each hoping to hurt the other, but not themselves be moved. Talk about piled high with difficulty. How can we disenthrall ourselves? Because it's a cinch that if neither side moves, nothing will change. Here are some clues. In 1914, during World War I, at Christmas time, soldiers along the trenches spontaneously called a truce and celebrated the holiday together. You might have heard about this. Did it end the war? No, but it stopped it for a day. That's worth remembering. They stopped being soldiers and were just boys. They played games. They smoked cigarettes. They drank. They did what boys did. Do you remember Westboro Baptist Church, that revolting community out in Kansas that would show up at funerals of people to talk about how God hates gay people? Well, there's a group that organized to show up when they did, and they called themselves the Angel Action Network. And what they were costumes with great big wings made of sheeting. And whenever the Westboro Baptist Church would show up, they would show up and create a corridor that separated the Westboro Baptist Church from the people they were trying to offend. They didn't hurt anyone, but they demonstrated in a curious and new way how to care for the other person. You may have noticed that in Minneapolis last month, the National Guard were activated by the governor to come and protect ICE from the protesters who were a threat. And so the guard showed up with coffee and donuts and gave it to the protesters. And they actually did protect ICE. They also protected the protesters. That kind of thinking anew, acting anew, is what is going to be required for the world to change, for this trench warfare to give way. I encountered a quote the other day. I don't remember who it was. The person writing it said, "When power is forced to arrest clowns, chase costumes, or explain why it's scared of jokes, it looks ridiculous. Humor is strategy with a grin." That's what innocence does. It disarms the hate and anger of the other by not being hateful and angry in return and asking it to play with us instead. Do you remember, some of you are old enough like me, how the protesters of the Vietnam War came to the Pentagon and their soldiers were out there holding out their guns, and one protester slipped the stem of a daisy into the rifle barrel, making it clear there was no violence they were bringing and turning the rifle into a flower vase. Did that end the war? No, but it did end. We need more childlike gestures, more thinking anew and acting anew that innocence brings, for us to end this awful state we are in. We need innocence, because only innocence that has not taken sides with reality, only innocence can conceive what people think is inconceivable, that can believe what other people think is unbelievable, which is premised on joy, which is looking always for newness in all things. And that is how we will disenthrall ourselves. Why am I telling you this? Because houses of worship are laboratories of innocence. Go to a political meeting and it's always about organizing and those are all important. I'm not denying that. But if you want to be truly disruptive, you've got to go where goofiness has a chance to take root. That's why our task as Unitarian Universalists, for ourselves, for the nation, is to go and get the innocence back. Like that one over there who knows better than to pay attention to me, but boy, have you got my attention, little one. One of the great Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, wrote a passage that is co-opted into the Christmas story. It's not about that, but you may remember the words. And a little child shall lead them. Doesn't have to be a child, but it can be you when you were 4, or you when you were 6, or you when you were 3. We are all capable of leading the revolution of innocence, provided you're willing to let the child disenthrall you. Thank you for letting me visit with you again today. We look back this